ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and all of you tuning in today. Imagine a giant waking up, rubbing its eyes, only to discover another giant not in its backyard, but at its threshold. And with that discovery, one's assumptions, one's strategies, one's power, and one's moral high ground all begin to tremble. This is the moment America finds itself in with India. For decades, many in Washington saw India as a latent promise, a growing democracy, a rising market, a counterweight in Asia. But too often, America misjudged India as a pliant partner, as a follower, as one whose choices would align neatly with U.S. strategic interests. The result: mispriced risks, missed opportunities, and a setback in leverage just when the global game is intensifying. Today, I want to explore with you the price America paid for misjudging India, not in platitudes, but in real dollars, lost influence, diplomatic missteps, and in the shifting sands of global power. America's trade policy toward India has been marked by a combination of short-term pressure tactics and long-term strategic misjudgments, and nowhere is this clearer than in the tariffs recently imposed on Indian goods. The U.S. decision to raise tariffs as high as 50% on certain Indian exports was framed as a response to India's refusal to break ties with Russia in the energy sector, particularly its continued purchase of discounted oil. On the surface, this may have looked like a targeted economic measure designed to punish India for what Washington perceived as disobedience. Yet the consequences are far more complicated, and they reveal the hidden costs of treating a growing economic power as if it were still a dependent junior partner. For Indian exporters, the immediate damage is obvious. Industries like textiles, gems, jewelry, seafood, and furniture are not marginal. They form the livelihood of millions of families. India's small towns and semi-urban regions rely heavily on export-driven production, and when tariffs eat into competitiveness, factories face closures, workers lose income, and ripple effects spread through communities that already live close to the edge of economic precarity. A U.S. consumer may not feel the immediate shock of a higher price on a diamond or a rug, but the Indian worker who loses her job because her goods are suddenly less welcome in American markets certainly feels it. However, the miscalculation runs deeper. By imposing these tariffs, Washington overlooked the very foundation of its strategic relationship with India, mutual economic benefit. Trade has been one of the few consistent bridges connecting the two countries despite differences in foreign policy. When that bridge is shaken by punitive measures, it risks more than dollars and cents. It undermines the trust that underlies political cooperation. India has options today that it did not have 30 years ago. It can redirect exports to Europe, the Middle East, or Africa. It can deepen its ties with Russia and China through the British framework, and it can nurture its domestic consumer base, which continues to expand rapidly. The tariffs do not trap India, they encourage it to diversify away from the United States. From the American perspective, the irony is striking. The tariffs were supposed to send a message of strength and control, but they expose vulnerability instead. American importers who rely on Indian inputs, from seafood wholesalers to jewelers to furniture retailers, are now faced with higher costs. Some will pass these costs on to consumers who are already strained by inflation. Others may cut jobs or reduce supply. At the macro level, discouraging Indian imports weakens the diversification of supply chains at a moment when Washington has been loudly proclaiming its desire to reduce reliance on China. By targeting India, the U.S. inadvertently strengthens China's relative position as the unavoidable hub of global manufacturing. The diplomatic dimension cannot be overlooked. India sees these tariffs not simply as an economic matter, but as a political signal, one that attempts to punish its assertion of sovereignty in foreign policy. When New Delhi insists on buying oil from Russia, it is not merely chasing a bargain, it is pursuing its national interest in securing affordable energy for a population of over 1.4 billion people. America's attempt to discipline that decision through trade penalties carries the whiff of a bygone era when Washington expected compliance from developing nations. But India is no longer in that category. It is the world's fifth largest economy, a nuclear power, and a critical player in global governance. To treat it as anything less is to misread the trajectory of world politics. The cumulative effect is that both sides lose. India pays a price in export competitiveness and job security, while America pays a price in credibility, supply chain resilience, and consumer costs. The tariffs symbolize more than a trade dispute. They embody the failure of U.S. policy to recognize India's growing independence. By misjudging India's capacity to chart its own course, America has weakened a partnership it claims to value, and it has sown seeds of distrust that will not be easily uprooted. When America engages with India, it often does so through the prism of expectation that New Delhi will behave as a reliable partner, follow Washington's lead in matters of global politics, and remain firmly aligned with U.S. strategic objectives. Yet this expectation is built on a misunderstanding of India's most consistent guiding principle, its insistence on strategic autonomy. For decades, India has made choices that prioritize its own national interest above the preferences of any external power. From its refusal to join military blocs during the Cold War to its recent decisions on energy, defense, and technology, India has signaled that it will not be pressured into abandoning its sovereignty. The failure to fully grasp this reality has led the United States into a series of diplomatic missteps that carry long-term costs. One of the most visible examples has been the U.S. reaction to India's continued partnership with Russia. Despite heavy Western sanctions, India has maintained and even expanded its purchases of Russian oil, arguing that it needs affordable energy to sustain its economic growth and protect the welfare of its citizens. Instead of acknowledging India's rationale, Washington often frames the decision as defiance or betrayal. Such rhetoric alienates New Delhi, particularly when it is made public, by reducing India's independent choices to disobedience. American leaders misread both the practical needs of a developing economy and the pride of a nation that has fought hard for its independence. The problem goes beyond energy. India's defense procurement strategy, which includes purchases from Russia, Israel, France, and the United States, reflects its desire to keep options open and avoid overdependence on any single supplier. Yet, Washington frequently interprets this diversification as hesitation or resistance to deeper alignment. By demanding exclusivity, America undermines the very flexibility that India sees as essential to its security. This disconnect fuels suspicion in New Delhi about whether the U.S. truly respects India as a partner or merely seeks to convert it into a subordinate ally. Diplomatic missteps are also evident in the language American leaders use. Public criticisms of India's democratic practices, harsh comments about its economic performance, or threats tied to visa policies and trade create resentment. While India is not immune to critique, the manner in which these statements are delivered, often through the lens of American exceptionalism, undercuts trust to the Indian public. It reinforces the perception that Washington is willing to embarrass or pressure their country whenever it does not conform. In a society deeply sensitive to dignity on the world stage, these moments carry weight far beyond the news cycle. Another oversight lies in assuming that India will always align with U.S. strategic goals in Asia. While Washington sees India as a counterweight to China, New Delhi sees China as a neighbor with whom it must compete, cooperate, and manage conflict simultaneously. India cannot afford to adopt an entirely antagonistic stance, as it shares a long border and deep economic ties with Beijing. Expecting India to fall into a rigid U.S.-led containment strategy ignores the complex calculus that governs Indian foreign policy. When America pushes too hard in this direction, it risks creating friction rather than partnership. The cumulative effect of these oversights is a gradual erosion of trust. India, once eager to strengthen ties with the United States, now weighs every gesture against the possibility of coercion or disrespect. The U.S., in turn, misinterprets India's hesitation as unreliability. What could have been a robust alliance of equals becomes a fragile relationship burdened by mutual suspicion. By misjudging India's independence and ignoring its sensitivities, America pays a price not only in lost influence, but in the credibility of its claim to respect diversity among its partners. The economic fallout of America's misjudgment of India has been profound, reverberating across both societies in ways that highlight the interconnectedness of modern trade. For India, the imposition of steep U.S. tariffs on its exports has been particularly damaging. Sectors like textiles, gems, jewelry, leather goods, and seafood have traditionally thrived on access to American consumers. These industries are labor intensive, providing jobs for millions of workers, many of whom come from rural or semi-urban communities with few alternative opportunities. When U.S. tariffs erode their competitiveness, the direct result is factory closures, unemployment, and shrinking household incomes. The blow lands hardest on ordinary Indians rather than political elites, deepening inequality and fueling social strain in a country still working to lift vast portions of its population out of poverty. The macroeconomic consequences for India are equally significant. Decline in export earnings weakens the rupee, raises the cost of imports, and feeds inflationary pressures that affect the entire population. Higher energy prices, amplified by the political tension surrounding Russian oil imports, ripple through the economy in the form of costlier transportation, food, and manufactured goods. For a government tasked with sustaining growth above 6% annually to meet developmental needs, these pressures complicate policy choices. To counter lost markets in the U.S., India must scramble to diversify its trade relationships, investing diplomatic and financial resources in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. While such diversification may pay off in the long run, the short-term adjustment is costly and disruptive. Yet the costs are not borne by India alone. American businesses and consumers are also caught in the backlash. U.S. importers who rely on Indian goods, whether jewelers sourcing cut and polished diamonds, seafood distributors supplying restaurants, or retailers selling Indian textiles, face higher costs due to tariffs. These costs either cut into business margins or get passed on to American consumers in the form of higher prices. At a time when inflation is already a pressing concern in the United States, tariffs that raise consumer costs further appear less like a tool of strategy and more like a form of economic self-sabotage. The supply chain consequences are equally problematic. Washington has spent years talking about the need to diversify away from China, spreading production and sourcing to other countries in Asia. India, with its scale, workforce, and growing infrastructure, was an obvious candidate for this role. By targeting India with tariffs and coercive trade policies, America risks undermining its own goal of building resilient supply chains. If Indian exporters feel squeezed out of the American market, they are more likely to strengthen ties with other buyers, including China itself. What was intended as a policy to assert leverage could end up reinforcing the very dependence on Beijing that Washington has long sought to escape. Diplomatically, the economic strains also come with hidden costs. When America imposes tariffs or threatens punitive economic measures, it weakens the trust required for cooperation on larger issues like climate change, global health, or defense partnerships. India, feeling treated as a target rather than a partner, becomes less willing to align itself with U.S. priorities in international negotiations. For Washington, this loss of goodwill translates into reduced influence in global forums where India's voice is increasingly decisive. Ultimately, both sides are left worse off. India pays in lost jobs, weakened exports, and rising economic uncertainty. America pays in higher consumer prices, diminished business competitiveness, and missed opportunities for supply chain diversification. Beyond these measurable losses, the greater cost is in the erosion of confidence between two of the world's largest democracies. Instead of a partnership built on shared prosperity, the relationship risks devolving into a cycle of mistrust where each side calculates the cost of the other's missteps. When America misjudges India, the consequences reach far beyond trade statistics or diplomatic friction. They reverberate through the architecture of global power. India is no longer a secondary actor whose choices can be managed or coerced by larger states. It is a rising pole in the international system with the demographic weight, economic growth, and geopolitical leverage to shape global outcomes. The United States, by underestimating India's insistence on sovereignty and independence, creates openings for rival powers to expand their influence and risks undermining its own long-term strategic position in Asia and beyond. One of the most immediate consequences is India's growing willingness to deepen ties with alternative partners. When U.S. relations soar, Russia remains a key supplier of energy and defense equipment to India, and the tariffs imposed by Washington in response to India's oil imports from Moscow only reinforce the perception in New Delhi that Moscow is a more dependable partner. At the same time, China, despite being a competitor and often an adversary, continues to maintain robust trade with India. America's failure to engage India with respect and foresight nudges New Delhi to hedge its bets by strengthening relationships in multiple directions, ensuring that it never becomes dependent on a single power. This hedging reduces Washington's leverage and dilutes its capacity to shape regional dynamics. The global balance of power is also shifting through multilateral organizations where India plays an increasingly prominent role. India's leadership in the BRICS bloc, its growing visibility in the G20, and its outreach to Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia all point toward a future in which New Delhi is not only a regional leader, but a global one. If America continues to treat India as a subordinate rather than a peer, it risks being excluded from the networks of influence that India is building. The recent momentum in BRICS, including efforts to bypass the US dollar in trade and financial transactions, reflects the very kind of alternative order that Washington fears. By alienating India, America accelerates the construction of that alternative. At the strategic level, America's misreading of India undermines efforts to counterbalance China in the Indo-Pacific. Washington has invested heavily in the notion that India will stand firmly alongside it in a USA-led security architecture, but India's approach to China is more complex than a binary contest of enemies. It seeks both to compete and to engage, to resist Chinese aggression at its borders while simultaneously maintaining economic ties and participating in forums like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. U.S. policymakers who expect India to simply adopt Washington's posture toward Beijing, misinterpret New Delhi's calculus. When they attempt to pressure India into rigid alignment, they only succeed in making India more cautious, less cooperative, and more determined to chart its own course. The erosion of trust also has consequences for global problem solving, from climate change to technology governance, pandemics to energy transitions. India's participation is indispensable. A strained USI-India relationship reduces the capacity of the two democracies to collaborate effectively in shaping global rules. Instead, India may choose to advance its interests in partnerships that exclude or even counter U.S. influence. The result is a diffusion of power where America finds itself less central to decision making, not because India opposes it outright, but because Washington miscalculated the terms of engagement. The geopolitical cost, then, is not simply the loss of one ally or one market. It is the weakening of America's global standing at a time when it can least afford to squander influence. By failing to recognize India's evolution into a fully independent power, the United States pays in diminished credibility, reduced leverage, and the rise of alternative alignments that reshape the balance of power away from its favor. So, what is the true price? It is seen in the silent withdrawal of trust between capitals. It is felt in factories closing, jobs lost, and markets shrinking. It is born in moral standing when public insults, economic coercion, and unilateral demands replace respectful partnership. And it is paid most emphatically in the arena of global influence, where the U.S. may find that others who once seemed peripheral are now central, not because America let them in, but because America failed to see them clearly. If America wishes not to pay even more for misjudgment, for arrogance, for strategic neglect, it must change course. It must recognize India not as a foil, but as a force, not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign partner, not as an issue to be managed, but as a power to be engaged with on terms of mutual respect. Thank you, not only for your attention, but for your hope that in understanding the price, we might avert still greater cost. Let us demand of our leaders wisdom, humility, and foresight, because in today's world, misjudging India is not just an error, it is a liability that none of us anywhere can afford.